So anyway, so when you think of an effective leader, somebody that's good at leading, what kind of leader do you think of? What comes to mind? It's not a trick question. There's tons of answers. Oh. Careful. What do you think, Millie?
Someone who knows the job and willing to be trained with others, but still be on top of it.
Okay. So they're knowledgeable. They know what they're doing. Yeah. What else?
I'd say a good communicator.
Yeah. Good communicator. Absolutely. What else?
Someone that can also relate to the people.
Yeah. Y'all ever had a boss or a leader, somebody that just doesn't relate, that doesn't get it? It's hard to connect and figure out what do they want and where are we going and all that. Yeah. Okay, what else?
Someone that can encourage and portray the idea or the thing that needs to happen.
Yeah.
Effectively.
Encourage, motivate. Yeah, absolutely. Get things done. Hey, Joey. There's literally 1,000 definitions of leadership out there. Every leader that's ever written a book or given a speech has come up with some definition of leadership. But what a lot of them have in common is this idea of inspiring. Leaders have influence. And so when you think of the different types of leaders, and a lot of times I'll ask a group like this, I'll say, do you consider, how many of y'all consider yourself a leader? And a lot of people, hey, come on in. Have a seat anywhere. A lot of times, when you ask people, do you consider yourself a leader? They're like, oh no, a leader's not me. A leader is somebody else. A leader is the president or the, either a politician or a sports star or a boss at work. I'm not a leader. But if you go with the definition of a leader as anyone who influences the thoughts and behaviors of other people, well, all of you are leaders. Everybody in this room influences the thoughts and behaviors of other people. And so when we talk about leadership, I don't want you to think of it as that other, the boss, somebody far out. I want you to think of it as yourself going, I influence the thoughts and behaviors of other people. And so whether it's in any variety of settings, now and in the future, you are a leader. And so when you hear discussions about leadership, I want you to think, this is me. This is, I'm going to have this kind of influence on people as we go forward. And so as we think of leadership, the hot new leadership theory these days is servant leadership. And I got a sampling of corporations today that espouse servant leadership. And they say servant leadership is our model of management. And so I'll start over here with this group. Fortune publishes the top companies to work for. Who are the best companies to work for? And if you look at their top 10 customers to work for, half of their top 10 say, we use a servant leadership style to manage our organization. SAS is over in the Carolinas. A lot of people aren't familiar with that name. They do a lot of business-to-business, analytic work, that type of thing. They're on the number one on the list. They were number one again this year. They're often number one on the list. And they say servant leadership is our model. This is the way we run our organization. And others there. Some of the others, Chick-fil-A wouldn't surprise any of you that they sponsor conferences on it and support it in a big way. Southwest Airlines is probably the first U.S. corporation that publicly said servant leadership is the way we're going to manage our company. And Southwest Airlines has outperformed every other airline for the past 30 years since they started, 38 years since they started, by orders of magnitude. They have far outperformed everybody else. And they say servant leadership is the way we do it. And there's some others as well. And so servant leadership is a great idea. And it all began with this guy named Robert Greenleaf. And so Greenleaf, 1970, published an article. 1977, he wrote this book. And this wasn't a Christian book. This wasn't, nowhere in there is there God, the Bible, anything mentioned. This is purely a secular corporate book designed to motivate those corporations that we just talked about to buy into this idea of why servant leadership works. And But he says in there, he goes, the servant leader is servant first. And he says, then the servant decides that they want to lead. But this is this idea of servant leadership. The servant part comes first before the leadership part. And so Greenleaf described this, and there's been a lot of research on it, but if we boil it down to what does this mean, servant leadership? Okay, you've heard the term, you know, what does it actually mean? There was some research done that sort of compiled all of the work that had been done into this one article, and they said there's really 10 things that define servant leadership. One is a servant leader practices what he or she preaches, serves people without regard to their nationality, gender, or race, sees serving as a mission of responsibility to others. So this is more than just a path, this is a mission that a servant leader's on. Shows genuine interest in employees as people, understanding that serving others is most important, is willing to make sacrifices to help others, seeks to instill trust rather than fear or insecurity, is always honest, is driven by a sense of higher calling, which I think that one's a really interesting one. Driven by a sense of higher calling. So like I said, he doesn't actually say Christian anywhere in there, but in the U.S. Culture that he's writing this in, that's sort of implied there. And then promotes values that transcend self-interest and material success. And so he defines these, he goes, this is what we're talking about when we're talking about servant leadership. And you look at that and he goes, those are all really admirable qualities. It's funny, when you look at that list, one of the first things I think of is, you know, this all sounds really familiar to us. As Christians, it's like, okay, when we read the teachings of Jesus and what he modeled for leadership, it's like, this really fits in. And so Christians have really adopted, and Christian leaders have really adopted this idea of servant leadership as something that we recognize and we agree with. We say, this is great stuff. Some of the stories that you may remember, so James and John, you remember they sent their mom to Jesus, and she says, you know, when you come in your glory, in your kingdom, let my boys sit on the right hand and the left hand in your kingdom. And of course the other disciples heard about this and they were indignant. And so Jesus had to call them all together, and he says, guys. He goes, no, you don't get it. He said, you know how the Gentiles, the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their high officials rule over them. And he goes, and I love this forward phrase, not so with you. In other words, you're different. You're not like that. And so then he goes on to say, whoever's going to be the greatest will be the servant. And he goes, I didn't come into the world to be served, but to serve. And so that's a great illustration of, okay, here's the expectations of Jesus, is to be the servant. So that fits well with servant leadership. And then, of course, you all know the story of the washing of the feet, where they go into the upper room and Jesus puts the towel on and he washes their feet. And so he's sort of modeling, okay, here's what I always love that section of John, 13 through 17 roughly, where, if you were dying and you knew you were going to die tomorrow and you had a chance to sit around with your friends and have a last conversation with them, that's basically John 13 to 17, where Jesus is sitting around and he goes, okay, let me bring it's almost like a capstone project right there at the end of Jesus' life, where he brings them together, goes, okay, let's pull together the last 3 years worth of teaching and make sure you understand it. And so he washes their feet, and he says, you call me Master and Lord, and rightly so, because that's what I am, but now that I've washed your feet, you should do the same for others. And so he sort of boils it all down and says, this is what I've been talking about, how you serve other people. And then finally, probably my favorite passage is Philippians 2, that Christology right there at the beginning of Philippians 2, where Paul says, do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility consider others more significant than yourselves. And then he goes on, he says, in relationships with one another, which I would also include leaders and followers in that category, in your relationships, have the same mindset as Christ Jesus, who being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. Rather, he made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant. So, sort of bringing all that servant leadership stuff together, you go, okay, this leadership theory that Jesus talked about 2,000 years ago in the Middle East, Mediterranean area, that culture from that time period, that works in the United States, Western culture in the year 2018 as we see corporate America adopting it and saying, this works. And so I find that to be fascinating, that it transcends, these concepts seem to transcend time and culture. But I think maybe we missed something in this process. Because if we look at only the servant aspect of Jesus, you sort of get this kind of weak image of Jesus where you go, okay, he was a doormat. If I do that, I'm going to be a doormat that's going to get walked all over. In fact, I was at a conference a couple of years ago. It's called the Believers in Business Conference. It's in Manhattan. It's run by MBA students, mostly Ivy League. So Harvard has a big group there, Penn's Wharton School, MIT, Stanford, Yale. These are the future CEOs of America join at this conference. And the problem they have, they're believers, but they don't get any indication of how their faith interacts with business in their schools. And so they have to come away for a weekend for a conference. And I've said before, I've never felt so smart and so dumb at the same time. So here I am with these brilliant people, and they're sitting there talking about very basic faith and business kind of conversations that we have all the time here. It's like this is easy stuff for us. And but anyway, so one of the conversations, there was a couple of senior partners from Goldman Sachs on Wall Street that were given a speech on servant leadership. And one of the guys from Harvard raises his hand and he goes, okay, that sounds really interesting, but if I do that, aren't I just going to be a doormat? I mean, how am I going to get to a C-level position in a corporation if I let everybody walk all over me as a servant leader? And the partners really sort of struggled a little bit. They hem-hauled around a little bit, and they basically came back with, well, it worked for Jesus, so it'll work for you. So, that's a bad answer. There's a better explanation than that. So let me put this aside for just a second and talk about another leadership theory. So Jim Collins is the best-selling business author of our generation. He's got a number of books out that have been New York Times bestseller. Good to Great's probably his most famous one. But he's best known for one chapter in Good to Great, probably about 5 pages is what he's best known for. And it's this idea of level 5 leadership. If any of y'all are familiar with that, heard of it? Yeah? It is, okay, so let me explain Good to Great a little bit first. The question he wanted to answer was, is it possible for a company that has been good for a long time to become great? Or are they just stuck with good? And so to analyze this, he looked at the stock returns of virtually every publicly traded corporation in America in the 20th century that was in business for a long time. And there were 1,435 corporations in his study. And he looked at it and he says, was there a time when any of these companies outperformed their industry by multiples, significantly outperformed the industry? And what he found was there were 11 companies out of the 1,435 that went from good to great. So then he and his research team dug into it to find out, okay, why? What made them different that allowed them to go from good to great? And one of the things they found, there were several things they found, but one of the things they found was the leadership style of the CEOs were different than the leadership styles of the comparison companies that did not make the leap. And it wasn't that the comparison companies didn't have good leaders. They all had good leaders. But it was a different style of leadership. And what they came to find was what he called a paradoxical blend of personal humility and professional will. And normally you don't see those go together like this. But these were CEOs that were humble, would build a great team around them, would defer to others, did not seek the spotlight, that kind of thing, but they were intense. And my favorite description of them, he says, they had an absolute, obsessed, burning, compulsive ambition that wasn't about them. It was about the company. It was about the cause, the organization. So he said it was an absolute, obsessed, burning, compulsive ambition that they were going to get things done for the organization. And one of the things that I noticed growing up on this campus, Johnson has had leaders like this for the past, as far as I know, it started with Dr. Eubanks. It probably goes back further than that. But Dr. Eubanks is the consummate level 5 leader. I mean, Jim Collins should have a picture of David Eubanks next to his definition. And he surrounded himself with other leaders that had the same thing. So the qualities they had. So on the personal humility side, there were 5 different things, and this was actually my doctoral dissertation was on this topic. So I have dug deep into this because I'm fascinated with it. This is cool stuff. But on the personal humility side, there were 5 descriptions that really sort of illustrated that. They're genuine, humble, a team player, servant attitude, and doesn't seek the spotlight. So those are the types of leaders. But at the same time, you also have this professional will, intense resolve, dedication to the organization, a clear catalyst in receiving results, strong work ethic, and self-motivated. And so to be considered a level 5 leader, somebody has to be strong in both of these categories. So you know people that are have personal humility that don't get anything done. So I've got a buddy of mine that in Atlanta that I worked with for years, and great guy. Personal humility, servant leader, absolutely. He doesn't get anything done. He talks stuff to death, and we'll be months later, hey buddy, are we about done with this? Are you ready? No, I need some more. Okay. So absolutely, he's a servant leader. He's personal, and by the way, there's a strong correlation between the personal humility and servant leaders. When you do the research and study that, they tend to be the same people. But then you also know people with professional will that have no humility. And you don't have to look past the White House to see this one. You know, I give Donald Trump these. There's no way, he's gonna match up on the humility side. So you see people that are strong in one area or not the other. And so the unique thing about this idea of level 5 leadership is they're both. And so anyway, whoops, I went the wrong way, didn't I? So this absolute, obsessed, burning, compulsive ambition idea is awfully wordy and hard to get to, and hard to sort of tie into a theology of leadership. But when you think of it, the word zeal is a good biblical word that really sort of captures that whole idea of absolute, obsessed, burning, compulsive ambition. So if we look at the definition of zeal, great passion or great enthusiasm, great energy or enthusiasm in pursuit of a cause or an objective. Another definition says fervor, passion, intense driving, feeling and conviction, deep desire or coveting, and intense heat. So it sort of captures Collins' idea of not just being humble and a servant, but driven to get results. And so that's the component I feel like when we talk about servant leadership. To me, it's missing this idea. So let's get into the theology a little bit. We can look at Scripture and we can find where this is absolutely consistent with Scripture. So for example, we go to Romans 12, where Paul talks about the parts of the body, how they all work together, the gifts of the Spirit and all of that in chapter 12. And so in this list, he's talking about gifts, and if you have these gifts, but he gets down to the one who has the gift to lead or the one who leads with zeal. So this idea of zeal is actually very scriptural. If we look at another, just a few verses down from that, never be lacking in zeal, but keep your spiritual fervor serving the Lord. And so when we look at leadership, zeal. And we look at the life of Jesus and we say, Jesus wasn't this doormat, patsy, just let everybody walk all over him. Jesus bowed his back sometimes. And had the righteous anger and showed this zeal in leadership. So remember the cleansing of the temple, and part of that story we forget a lot of times, his disciples remembered that it's written, zeal for your house will consume me. So Jesus was consumed with zeal. in his leadership. So he wasn't just this, I love all the movies that we have where it has Jesus sitting on the rock, speaking very softly and very calmly. And there were times when that's not how he spoke. One of my favorite examples is the woes to the Pharisees in Matthew 23. So this doesn't have the word zeal in it, but it sort of shows, this is one of those quotes that I just can't see Jesus saying in a calm, low voice. I imagine he was probably yelling at this point. He says, "Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You travel over land and sea to win a single convert, but when you have succeeded, you make him twice as much the son of a child of hell as you are." So Jesus was pretty intense when he got into conversations, particularly with the Pharisees and all. Get into the New Testament, Peter and John, and this sort of gets into that obsession piece of it. When they get called in front of the Sanhedrin for doing things that they didn't feel the Sanhedrin didn't think they should be doing, Peter and John replied to him, "Which is right in the eyes of God, to listen to you or to him? You be the judges. As for us, we cannot help but speak about what we have seen and heard." So that's sort of that, like I said, that obsession. We can't help it. This is what we do. And so I think there's a number of examples in the New Testament, but you could even go back to the Old Testament. And I love this quote. I don't know if y'all have been familiar with this quote from Jeremiah. "His word is in my heart like a fire shut up in my bones. I am weary of holding it in. Indeed, I cannot." Have you ever met a leader that just had that passion and enthusiasm and a fire? That's a powerful leader that gets things done. And so I love this quote from Jeremiah where he says, this is like a fire in my heart. I can't hold it in. So one of the other interesting things is the focus of a leader. So we've talked about servant leadership in level 5. So let me just tell you a little bit about, a lot of times they're the same leaders. When we do research and we ask people, describe your boss and say, here are the qualities of a servant leader and here are the qualities of a level 5 leader. And are they servant leader or level 5 leader? Most of the time, they're either both or they're neither. So a level 5 leader and a servant leader tend to be the same people for the most part. The interesting thing is there's a really key distinction between the difference between the two. So if we look at a servant leader is focused on serving their followers. Organizational objectives are subordinate. So in other words, if you're a servant leader, you are most passionate about helping the people that follow you. I met one of my customers in my old corporate job, and I knew he was the CEO of the company that he was running. He had a small company of about 50 employees probably. And he gave me his business card, and again, I knew he was the owner and the CEO, but on his business card, it said his title was CHRO. And I said, okay, you got my curiosity. What is a CHRO? Chief Hurdle Removing Officer. I was like, that's brilliant. That's exactly a servant leader, is I'm going to hire great people around me, and I'm going to get the hurdles out of their way. I'm going to make sure they're successful in the organization. And the focus of the servant leader, though, also says organizational objectives are subordinate. In other words, if my followers are happy, then my assumption is the organization's going to do well. But not necessarily. So again, in my old job, I had sales managers that I felt were servant leaders in that they would serve their sales reps. So each of them had about 8 sales reps. Our company had changed the rules several times on compensation, on territories, on all that, and the whole sales team was just furious with management. But the sales managers really took care of their sales reps. So what happened is they became servant leaders in that they were serving their sales reps and they wanted their sales reps to be successful, but whether the company made any money or not, or any profit, they really didn't care. If the company does well, great, happy for them, but as long as my people are happy and satisfied and enjoy their job, that's what I'm going for. The opposite then, on level 5 leadership, they're in service to the organization, not their followers. So a level 5 leader is going to be passionate about making sure that the organization is successful. If the people are happy in the process, then great. But that's not the goal. That's not the original objective. And again, most of the time, these are the same people. If you care about your people, you also care about your organization. If you care about the organization, you probably care about the people that make up the organization. So most of the time, but not necessarily. It can be different. So out of curiosity, what are your thoughts on that as far as what's better? Is it better to be in service to your employees or to make sure the organization's successful? If you had to pick one.
If an organization isn't successful, there are no need for employees.
That's a good point.
If you serve your employees, you can make your organization more successful by making them be better at what they're doing.
Yeah. But if you had to pick one, what's more important?
I would say you focus on the people around you.
It's an interesting debate because you can make a good point on either side of that. There was a great interview that I saw between Andy Stanley and Jim Collins. So Andy Stanley, you all probably familiar with him down at North Point Church in Alpharetta, Georgia, just north of Atlanta. Jim Collins is the good to great guy. And so they were at Catalyst Conference a few years ago, and Andy Stanley was interviewing Jim. And this was several years ago, but it was a great interview. And basically, Andy Stanley asked Jim that question. And in the book Good to Great, he talks about having the right seats on the bus and making sure the right people are on the bus and they're in the right seats on the bus. And that if they're not, then you need to get the people that are. Rearrange the seats, whatever, as far as moving people around the organization. And Andy asked him, he said, we're, as church leaders, we're in a culture of grace here. We don't fire people very often. We don't demote people very often. This is not what we do. And he said, how would you respond to that? So Colin steps back and he says, if you've got the wrong people in the bus in a business, in a corporation, that's not good. You're going to lose money. The wrong person in the wrong position is going to hurt the business. He says, so that's not good. He goes, but if you're working for a nonprofit homeless shelter and somebody freezes to death on the street because you don't have the right person, the right job, where do your loyalties lie? If you're at a church and you believe that people are going to go to hell if they don't hear the Word of God, and you've got somebody in the wrong place that's causing people not to hear the Word, where do your loyalties lie? Do the loyalties lie to the person that you're serving? Or do your loyalties lie to the person that your employee or the person that you're serving? Which is really fascinating. The audience got really quiet when he said that, because that's not typically how we think. But I thought he had an awesome point. You got to sit back and go, where do my loyalties lie? And sometimes I think we come up with a different answer and how we lead in that case. And that sort of got me thinking, really, your loyalties lie to the cause, to the organization. So whether it's a business or whether it's a church or a nonprofit or whoever it is you're working for, you got to think, where do my loyalties lie as far as the success? If it's a business, you're right. If the business is not successful, nobody's got a job. But same with the church, costs are even higher, you might argue, or a nonprofit or whatever. So anyway, it's an interesting thought to think about, that as you become more engaged in leadership positions as you graduate and move on, and to think about how do I lead, and am I leading on purpose? One of the challenges that I see in organizations as we look at leaders is most people don't intentionally think about what is my leadership style? How do I want to lead? They just sort of default, and maybe there's a mentor they're watching, or maybe there's they just say, hey, this is my personality, this is how I do it. But one of the things I'd challenge you to do as you think about leadership and as you get out and you take management positions in churches or nonprofits or organizations, wherever you are, is to sort of think through, what am I trying to accomplish here? What's my leadership style? How do I want to do this? And be intentional about it. Don't just back into it and accept the way somebody else has always done it or what you feel, your gut might tell you that the way you ought to do it. Any other thoughts or comments on that?
So the part that I guess the reason why I feel servant leadership can sometimes take a little bit of precedent, just because you're serving your followers doesn't mean that you're going to always be nice to them, or that you're not going to reprove them or rebuke them for doing bad. Jesus called down his disciples often. He told certain people when they just wouldn't listen to him, "Hey, I'm done. Get away from me." And so I think that by serving other people, if you were to just bring somebody along just because they were in that position, and you're not gonna, even though you can't teach them, and you're gonna just kind of leave them in that position, you're not actually serving them.
Right.
Putting them in another position, taking them to somewhere where they can learn, and then possibly grow back into a person that could fill that position would actually be serving them.
Yeah.
And so I think it's kind of the way that you're looking at how you're serving the people that are around you as well.
Yeah, that's a great point, because what's funny is when you fire somebody and they come back later and thank you, that was probably a good firing for everybody, because I had a lady that worked for me when I was at Kimberly-Clark, and she was just a bad fit on my team. I had her in an analyst role, and she was just not a numbers person. And she was horrible. And I didn't actually fire her, but I got her into another job, which for me was just as good. But I got her over into a customer service job where she could talk to people and she didn't have to do math. And she loved it. She was thrilled. And she comes back and says, "Oh, thank you for kicking me off your team." It was not exactly it, but that was sort of the implication. But I've got a friend in Atlanta that he has a way. He works for a large management company, property management, apartments and that kind of thing. So he has a lot of maintenance guys that work for him and customer service people and that kind of thing. And he's got a way of firing people that make them say thank you, because he helps them see, and to your point, this is the idea of servant leadership. So he gets the right person either in the right seat or off the bus, but he helps them see why this is not a good fit for you. And let me help you get to a place that is a good fit, that you're going to be happier, we're going to be everybody's going to be happier. So yeah, that it can be done, and I've seen it done well. But most of the time, that's not what's done. Yeah. All right, so when we think about all of those things and how they come together, so we look at servant leadership, we look at zeal and how those, and what's the priority of what we do. We come into this new, and I just made up this term with a Z, servant leadership, where it sort of combines all of that to say we need to look at more than just servant leadership. There's a lot more that goes into it than that, and so we can combine it. And I'm actually hoping to do a little research and a little writing on this idea and how that. So you're sort of my guinea pig audience today to talk through some of those things. But anyway, all right. So that is all I've got to say about the topic. Any questions or comments? So help me in my writing and research to tell me what you think or what you wish you would have heard. And it will be constructive, because I'm hoping to write a book on this topic. So we'll see how that goes. But I'm really curious what people think about what made sense, what didn't make sense, what you wish you heard more of or less of or whatever. What do you think?
I think you have a ton of great points, because normally I think of leader as the servant, area, and I actually read Jim Collins' book, and it was really good. But when you compared the five, what was it, 5-level, what was it?
Yeah, wait a minute.
I just saw it. Oh, shoot.
Oh, did I go past it?
5
No.
leaders. No, level 5 leaders. When you compared those and the servants, I liked how you kind of pointed out that even in like a church setting, there can be some business tactics that are still biblical.
You know, I'm always amazed at how much secular research confirms biblical principles. So I've talked through this one and how servant leadership and all of that's used in corporate America. Another one, have you all read StrengthsFinder 2.0? You seen that? That's actually so Collins is the best-selling author of the generation. StrengthsFinder 2.0 is the best-selling business book of our generation. And basically what he says is instead of spending so much time trying to build up your weaknesses, focus on your strengths and get really good at those. And it really goes along with 1 Corinthians 12, Romans 12. We talk about the parts of the body and how we're all gifted with different things, different gifts, and how when they all work together. Well, it's very much a business concept. It's how you build a team, is you get people with the different talents and gifts, whether you're in a church or nonprofit or business, whatever. So yeah, it's often the secular research comes back, and even if it's not written in biblical terms, you can see the parallels and you go, yeah, it worked 2,000 years ago in the Middle East and it still works in corporate America today. Yeah.
How would you guide somebody that's maybe like on the humility side, but more will? How would you?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. And actually, Jim Collins has struggled with that one. He published this book in 2001, and one of the big questions that people asked that he struggled with answering was, is it possible if you're not a level 5 leader to become a level 5 leader? So you're lacking in one or both of these areas. Is it possible to get there? And he really struggled with how to answer that. And he finally came back probably 5 years after the book was finished. And he finally came back and he goes, yeah, I've seen it. It can happen. To me, the professional will is a little easier to come up with than personal humility. You know, just to pick on him again, is Donald Trump ever going to have the qualities of personal humility in his lifetime? I think if he tried his hardest, he'd have a hard time coming up. Maybe he could, but that's just not the way he's wired, you know. Lee Iacocca is an example that Collins used. Lee Iacocca is the same way. Lee Iacocca's he's the one that invented the Ford Mustang back in the day. Christ took over Chrysler. He's got an ego as big as the room, and he's probably always going to have that. The professional will, and I think you can. I think you can become more humble through effort and working with people, and I think that's possible. I think most people don't go to the trouble of doing it. The professional will, to me, and I'm sort of curious what you all think, but here's my thought. To me, the key for that is getting into an area where you've got passion. You know, there are things in life that you do. So, for example, in my career, there were parts of my career that I just didn't have a passion for. It was sitting in front of Excel spreadsheets in an office, it was just, my eyes were glazing over, I didn't care, and it was just hard to be motivated. It was hard to have all of these things when I'm sitting here looking at this Excel spreadsheet all the time. However, if I can see myself as serving my clients, as I did in a future job, where I say, okay, I'm doing some good here. I'm helping people, and that helps in that regard. But really, for me, coming back to Johnson is what got me here. Because I was probably a little weak on this. If you'd asked me 10 years ago in my corporate job, I would not have been here as far as a rating score. But when I get here and I'm working with students and I'm working with the faculty and working with alumni and all the things that we do here, okay, now I've hit my sweet spot. I'm wired for this. I've got that. What do y'all think?
Simon Sinek does a lot of work on that, and I think that your why.
Exactly. You start with why.
So you're having this clear purpose. What is waking you up in the morning? What's getting you out of bed? He said before in one of his, maybe his TED Talk, anyways, but be relentless about the thing that sets your soul on fire.
Yeah.
In pursuit of the thing that sets your soul on fire. So I think part of that is the professional will.
That's a great example. I'm going to bring that into this too, because that's right. That's
in my field, so I like in the athletics realm. But that's what it's all about, right? Like in order to motivate an athlete, a coach, whatever that is, and a lot of what you're talking about, this Zervant leadership, that fits within our coaching mold of what you want. You need to have this cause, right? Because if your athletic organization isn't doing well, you're fired. So the end. And you have a very short window of time to make that turnaround. And so, while yes, it's important that your staff is doing well and all of those things, ultimately the buck stops at the head coach. And if you're not doing well, you and your whole team, you're out the door.
Yeah.
So there's an aspect of taking care of your team in that. But I think your why is what gets you going.
Yeah.
You may know the how and you know the what it is, but at the end of the day, if you're not connected with the why, you're not going to have the will.
Yeah. Have y'all familiar with Simon Sinek? He's got the third most watched TED Talk of all time, and it's Start With Why is the title of it, and we use it in the leadership course in the MBA. So Derek and Joey have seen it, but that's one if you're just sitting around, pull up YouTube and or Google or whatever. But he's got it on YouTube. But type in Simon Sinek and watch that one. It's a really interesting talk. Yeah, Derek.
Research, have you ever come across somebody, I guess it would be an executive who adopts a servant leadership model? Do they ever have a hard time reconciling their style with fiduciary duties or, stakeholder, shareholder interests or anything?
I think there can be conflict there. Because if you know what's best for your followers, and particularly if you're not the CEO. So a lot of times we're talking about the CEO. Well, the CEO can call the shots pretty much, as long as the board doesn't object. But when you're the middle manager, it gets tougher. Because you've got, and this sort of goes back to my story about my sales managers, where the sales managers were sort of the middle managers. They did not agree with what senior management was doing. And they were coaching their sales team and serving their sales team, but not senior management. And so that gets into fiduciary responsibilities. Hey, we hired you to do this job, and just because you don't agree with what the senior managers are doing, it can raise some conflict, I think. Trying to think of it as specific. I can't think of a specific, but particularly, I guess what I'm thinking is if the CEO or senior executive do not subscribe to a servant leadership model. It makes it a lot easier if you're at Chick-fil-A and you want to be a servant leader to your employees. You're backed up all the way up the chain. But if you're working at a place that does not subscribe to that subscribes to maximize the bottom line at whatever cost you have to, then there's going to be some conflict. I would, if it were me, I would get to an organization that fit my personality and profile as a manager. I don't think I'd last long as a middle manager in an organization that was all bottom line all the time. Yeah.
I work at Food City, and I feel like sometimes they kind of try to be serving, but I think a lot of times it really does focus a lot on the bottom line.
Yeah.
And
It is a tough balance, because as a manager, you do have to be aware of the bottom line. Because like we said, if you don't make a profit, the business closes and everybody loses their job. So it has to be a profitable business to be sustainable. So sometimes it is a bit of a balance there. Yeah. All right, well, I'll let you all go. But thank you for coming. Appreciate it.